On calm nights, Monroe Lake reflects three shadows, though only two people sit on the bench. He pretends not to notice the extra silhouette, but always stretches out his hand to him.
The first fissure opened under Claire Monroe's boots before sunrise, when the construction lights still burned a harsh white against the half-built skeleton of the bottling plant. The air above Redwillow, Oregon, tasted of wet pine, diesel, and cooled metal. The Columbia lay somewhere beyond the tree line as a pale breath in the dark, but up on the ridge the concrete itself seemed to hum like a slow engine waking. Claire stepped out of her rental SUV, the high-visibility vest stiff over her blazer, and crossed the slab with her clipboard pressed tight against her ribs. The crack waited near the center of the newest pour, a thin circle in the gray. When she went down on one knee and spread her fingers over it, the concrete felt wrong. It was cool, but not dead. Her palm met a damp, faintly pulsing surface, as if the ridge exhaled through pores. Moisture filmed her skin. A shiver ran from the heel of her hand to the small of her back. She pulled away too fast, breath catching in her throat, then forced herself to flatten her hand again for one more second, just long enough to confirm that the tremor under the slab did not match the vibration of any visible machine. Trucks rolled along Route 14 below, headlights smearing across neat rows of houses and the dark rectangle of the high school football field. Years earlier, she had sat on those rusted bleachers with a backpack between her sneakers, a nausea in her gut that had nothing to do with motion and everything to do with a missed period and a boy already turning away. The same tight, low knot woke now, as if her body remembered exactly how it had seized the last time the ground under her life shifted without warning. By mid-morning she stood in the air-conditioned trailer that served as the site office. Maps and pump diagrams crowded the walls. Richard Hale, the man who had once been a name on her mother's unsent letters and now signed emails as her father, leaned on the laminated table. He tapped a knuckle against a cross-section of the aquifer beneath Redwillow's ridge, his tone steady while he talked about sustainable branding, market share, and access to a cold, clean reservoir big city investors would envy. The county deeds lay between two foam coffee cups, thin pages that smelled of dust and toner. One handwritten note from the 1920s mentioned a keeper of the springs and looping ink that slanted like a current. She rested the ball of her pen on that phrase a heartbeat longer than necessary. The engineer beside them shifted, cleared his throat, and pointed at one of the pump capacity figures. He spoke of efficiency and flexibility, hinting that nothing stopped them from drawing more than the conservative numbers they had filed. Richard's fingers drummed once on the table in approval, then stilled. Claire's jaw tightened. She nodded as if conceding the point, let the conversation roll on toward timelines and ribbon cuttings, and only later, when the men stepped outside to take calls, went back to circle the original limit in her notebook with a hard, dark line. Then she signed her name on the new permits in small, precise strokes that dug grooves into the paper. Down in town, Redwillow's morning routines moved on without waiting for her decisions. School buses sighed at the four-way stop by Buck's Diner. Kids in hoodies and Letterman jackets spilled out, sneakers tapping the crosswalk paint. The one Starbucks sign on Main Street blinked unevenly through lingering fog. Pickup trucks lined up at the Chevron, taillights glowing dull red in the gray half-light, while the hardware store door carried a fresh marker script notice about fishing licenses and a fundraiser for the marching band. Claire parked in front of the diner with her company badge still at her collar. The smell of bacon grease and drip coffee drifted out when she pushed the door, and a brief hush of glances slid over her and away again, the town's muscle memory of scandal and departure contracting and releasing in one small motion. Adam Reyes stood outside, anchored to the cracked sidewalk by work boots and the weight of a cell phone pressed to his ear. He had the build of a man who lifted lumber more than gym weights, shoulders carrying a quiet, practiced burden. A thin streak of white paint ran along his forearm, ending at the crease of his wrist. His daughter, Lily, traced a smiley face in the fogged diner window with one finger. When Claire stepped past, his body shifted almost imperceptibly to make room, the kind of automatic courtesy that did not seek thanks. She registered the faint scrub of sawdust on his jeans, the notch of tiredness at the corner of his mouth, the paler band of skin where a ring had once rested. Then she kept walking, the brief brush of shared air following her back to the car like the lingering smell of coffee on her clothes. The act bent toward its hinge when Vince Porter stepped back into her orbit. In the high school gym, under buzzing fluorescent lights and championship banners, folding chairs scraped as townspeople asked about noise, truck routes, and well levels. Claire fielded questions about filtration and safety standards, shoulders lifting and settling with each answer. Vince watched from the side, tie loosened, then moved in once the crowd thinned. Later, in the echoing hall that smelled of floor polish and old sweat, he walked beside her. He spoke in measured phrases about community partnership, side stream export potential, and keeping their water from being entirely owned by out-of-state suits. His words stayed just this side of polite, but the tilt of his head when she mentioned environmental caps and the way his jaw locked when she did not offer concessions made his intention sharper than anything he said aloud. That night she sat on the back steps of the rental on Birch Street, the wood slightly splintered under her bare feet. Sprinklers hissed on and off up and down the block in a staggered pattern, clicking like soft metronomes. Beyond the last porch lights the ridge was a dark, heavy line. Somewhere down the hill, a siren wailed and faded. Her calves tightened instantly, the back of her neck prickling. The sound hooked into an older memory, an ambulance cutting across a twilight parking lot, red spinning light mapping itself onto the slick hospital tiles where she had waited in a thin gown while a nurse listed risks in a bored tone. Her hand found the porch rail now, fingers wrapped so hard the wood bit into her palm. She made herself breathe through the echo, in slow counts, until the tightness ebbed. Then she picked up the rolled blueprints again. The plant would go ahead on schedule. No delays for stories or tremors. If the ridge wanted to argue, it could argue with her. Summer pushed into Redwillow with early dawns and late blue evenings. Sun slid down the plant's steel frames every morning, lighting up bolts and welds until they flashed like coins. Claire split her time between the cold, humming conference room where reports shifted across the big screen and the echoing floor where forklifts beeped and workers shouted over the clatter of pallets. The slab under her soles thrummed with a bass note that synced with her heartbeat when she paused too long in one place. She walked faster when that happened, heels striking a sharper ribbon to drown it. Adam entered the project like a necessary fix. The first interior contractor walked off after a payment argument with Vince, and the timeline sagged under the weight of unfinished framing. Adam's carpentry crew arrived in dusty pickups, radios already tuned to stations that bled rock and country into the morning air. Tool belts hung low on their hips, and the smell of cut lumber floated behind them. In the half-lit interior, metal studs and wood beams slowly turned into halls and offices under their hands. Adam read plans without fuss, checked measurements twice, and kept his tone even when he showed Claire why a wall needed to shift or a doorway required reinforcement. He glanced at her badge only once, then focused back on the beams like he trusted her to carry her share. She understood his. Small customs grew between them before any heavier words. On mornings when she arrived very early, the ridge still wrapped in mist, his truck already idled near the loading bay, exhaust curling behind it. She began bringing an extra paper cup of coffee from the kiosk on River Road and leaving it on the corner of a sawhorse. He started lining the empty cups later in a straight line on the edge of the scrap bin, each rim aligned, as if they were another set of fasteners to be counted before the day ended. At the grocery store on Jackson Avenue, their carts ended up in the same lane more often than statistics allowed, her basket with packaged salads and microwave meals, his cart with cereal, work gloves, sports drinks, and, on one Thursday, a small grocery store bouquet that Lily later stuck into a jar and fussed over like a new pet. Claire watched the way his hand hovered near the flowers, protective without ownership, and something in her chest loosened half a notch. The town around them tightened instead. Wells on the outskirts dipped lower than usual. In Buck's diner, older men in thief caps compared notes between refills, weathered fingers tracing invisible maps on the formica as they talked about drains running slower and strange ground fog around the ridge at dawn. At the city office, Vince spread revised contracts on a laminate table, reading glasses low on his nose, thumb absently flicking through text messages from his teenage son about practice schedules and gas money. Each buzz pulled his gaze for a second, softened the muscles around his mouth, then the numbers on the page reeled him back. His fingers smoothed the stack of agreements with a motion more familiar than the one he used to scroll through the boy's messages, and in the end the papers went into his briefcase while the unanswered texts sat blinking in his phone. One hot afternoon, Claire descended into the county archives below the old brick courthouse. The air was cooler there, striped by bars of light from tall, narrow windows. Dust eddied when she slid boxes from shelves, the cardboard rough under her knuckles. She dug past typed deeds and smudged survey maps until she found a slim ledger in a woman's careful hand. The entries detailed flow rates and droughts with a precision her engineers would have respected. In the margins, smaller notes mark years when water was shared with neighbors whose wells ran dry or when the town pastor warned against letting outsiders tap the deep vein. One line, barely darker than the paper now, recorded a day in 1923 when a woman listed only by first name refused a developer's offer. The next sentence mentioned shattered windows in town and the crack in the church foundation, followed by a note that the spring's taste had sweetened after the quake. Claire closed the book slowly and returned it to the shelf, the pads of her fingers tingling as if they had brushed live current. Back at the plant, she carried that tingle into action. Sitting alone with the pump schedules, she adjusted them. The changes looked like optimization, slightly lower maximum draw rates, a softer ramp-up curve, a marginal increase to the municipal line at the expense of the future export path. In reality, those edits meant the town's taps would run a little fuller while Vince's sign scheme would have less water to hide. Her pen left deeper grooves in her notebook as she wrote the justification she would give if anyone asked. No one did. She sent the file through the internal system, shoulders squaring after each click, then walked out onto the mezzanine overlooking the plant floor. Below, Adam and his crew lifted the last interior wall into place, muscles in his forearms standing out as he steadied the stud. Sunlight broke through a gap in the roof at that exact moment, turning the dust around him into a bright, drifting haze. Her chest expanded more deeply than usual, as if the ridge's hum had briefly matched some private, steadier rhythm inside her. Storms built over the Cascades, sending thick, charged air rolling down into the valley. One evening, a rush order of treated lumber arrived late, a semi backing up to the plant with its hazard lights blinking against a sky the color of bruised steel. The regular crew had gone home under warnings of lightning, but the load could not sit unsecured. Claire stayed. Adam returned when the driver called him, shirt still damp from a quick shower, boots unlaced. They worked side by side under the truck's open trailer lights, moving planks and strapping them under a tarp. Rain began in hard, spaced drops that slapped metal with sharp ticks, then thickened into a roar on the roof. Each time he passed a board, their fingers brushed for a fraction too long, calloused palm against her smaller, tightening grip. They talked only about schedules and overtime, about roof loads and storm codes, but his presence at her shoulder steadied the restless drum of water overhead. When the last ratchet strap clicked into place, thunder cracked directly above them. The ground jumped. Her lungs seized in the same high, shallow hold they had adopted the night she had listened to the rising whine of an ambulance siren. For one beat she was back there, gown thin against her skin, fluorescent lights buzzing. Adam's hand closed around her elbow, firm and warm, entirely in the present. Muscles along her spine tensed, then deliberately uncoiled under that grip. She nodded once, a small, grateful tilt, and stepped back from the truck as lightning forked over the ridge. Another day, Lily's science teacher assigned a project on local ecosystems. Claire offered a plant tour as an educational angle, framing it as outreach when she cleared it with the safety officer. In hard hats and goggles too big for her face, Lily walked beside her through the quieter sections, notebook clutched to her chest. Claire pointed out intake filters, explained pH levels in simple images, showed where the town line flowed and where the plant loop began. She kept her hands moving, tracing pipes in the air, tapping valves, drawing invisible arrows, voice softer than the one she used in meetings. Above, on an unfinished catwalk, Adam watched with an expression that mixed pride and wary hope, fingers curled around the rail until his knuckles paled. When Lily later spread her poster board on the kitchen table, her colored pencil river wrapped around the carefully drawn circle labeled Spring Keeper, a term she had pulled on her own from Claire's offhand mention of the old ledger. The ridge answered the growing strain with its own language. Night storms shook Birch Street, tearing small branches from the maples and flinging them onto car hoods. Security footage from the plant showed brief horizontal flashes under the slab during heavy rain, as if lightning had decided to travel sideways through stone. One night a hairline crack opened in the ceiling of Claire's hallway, chalk dust crumbling down onto her bare shoulder as she brushed her teeth. Her heart punched against her ribs. The bathroom spun. She pressed a palm flat against the cool tile, forced air into tight lungs one counted breath at a time, and understood with fresh clarity that the coming breaking point would not let her stand at a safe distance. The day the water rose began with a glare that made the ridge look almost flat, all subtle contours washed out under a hard white sun. The plant looked still from the outside, a gray and silver husk against the blue. Inside, test runs finally ramped toward full capacity. Pumps kicked in. Motors climbed in pitch. Pipes vibrated in their brackets. The air near the floor held a faint metallic tang, like pennies rubbed between fingers. Claire arrived early to watch the numbers climb from the control level. The main valve room sat deep under the plant, a concrete chamber lined with panels and thick pipes that pulsed faintly with the force rushing through them. Green lights indicated flow to the town, blue to the plant, red to the long dry spillway slot cut into old riverbed that curled around the edge of town. On the screens, digital gauges ticked smoothly upward as the system drew water from the underground reservoir. Claire stood with both hands resting on the metal railing, the bar cool against her palms, and followed each rise with her eyes. The hum underfoot no longer felt like an abstract vibration. It felt like an animal's breath, pulled in and held. The first jolt came almost gently, a slow heaving motion that made the hanging cable sway. A second, sharper motion followed, snapping a light fixture so that it swung wildly, casting stuttering shadows. Dust sifted from the ceiling joints. On a side monitor, a reservoir graph shot up in a spike that did not fit any simulation curve she had reviewed. For a heartbeat, the alarm system hesitated, as if shocked. Then a red banner spread across 3 screens at once. Somewhere up in the plant proper, something heavy clanged to the floor. The distant rumble of machinery blurred with a deeper sound that rose from below, as if the bedrock had begun to speak in a low, continuous vow. Boots hammered down the corridor. Vince appeared first, tie loosened, safety goggles askew, skin pinched tight around his mouth. Behind him hovered a foreman, eyes wide. Adam arrived a beat later, breath rough from running, sweat already darkening his t-shirt at the collar despite the cool basement air. He had seen a hairline fracture flowering along an upstairs corridor wall and followed the pattern back to its source. On the main screen, inflow from the aquifer jumped again, now outstripping what any outtake could carry. The reservoir-level arrow slid into a zone that engineers in another state had labeled with cautious, theoretical language. The pressure bars for the town and plant lines crept toward maximum tolerances. The red spillway bar slept at 0. Droplets formed on the valve housings, beating and running down in erratic paths, as if the steel itself sweated. Sirens started somewhere overhead as the plant's internal alarms triggered the town system. The sound knifed through layers of concrete, a rising, falling note that sent Claire's shoulders up toward her ears. Her calves clenched. Her stomach pulled in, the same involuntary lock it had taken years ago when she had waited for a doctor to come back with results she already half knew. For a breath, the control room walls narrowed like a hospital corridor. She gripped the rail harder until the metal bit into her palms and focused on the numbers instead of the sound. Vince surged toward the panel, weight thrown forward. His hand went for the manual override on the blue valve, the one that controlled flow to the plant. His jaw fixed around words he did not bother to say. Pocketed against his hip, his phone buzzed twice, a new message from his son asking if he would make it to that night's game. The vibration brushed his leg. His fingers kept closing over the metal lever instead. Adam stepped between Vince and the controls almost on instinct, boots spreading to take the force of the other man's shoulder, chest rising high from the sprint. He planted his palm flat on the panel edge, body turned just enough to give Claire a clear line. Sweat ran from his temple into the corner of his jaw. His free hand hovered for a moment between bracing himself and reaching toward her, then stayed braced, ready to catch or anchor. The red valve waited within her reach. The emergency spillway. The line no one had expected to touch outside of drills. Claire's right hand lifted as if hauled by a rope from her chest. Lily's poster board flashed in her mind, the circle labeled Springkeeper floating in color pencil blue. So did the curve of trailers sitting low in the old river loop, the swing set at the park, the hospital up on the rise, the houses along Burke Street that had shuttered in the last storm but stayed standing. The calculus crowded her in a hot, physical rush rather than a tidy mental list. Hold the water here and risk the ridge fracturing under everyone. Shut down and hope the pressure bled off in time. Or open the only route built to carry force away fast, knowing it would carve its own cost along the way. Her fingers closed over the red valve. The metal was slick with condensed moisture. The first attempt slipped. Her shoulder jerked once, tendons in her neck straining. She inhaled hard enough to feel the edges of her lungs, tightened her hand, and pulled. The valve resisted with a deep groan, then jolted past its sticking point in a motion that sent a shudder up her arm into her teeth. On the monitors, the spillway gauge leaped from flatline to a surge that filled the screen in waves of color. Pipes downstream rattled. Somewhere far below, a gate that had not moved in decades tore itself open under a force it recognized anyway. The ground no longer trembled, it lurched. A diagonal crack ripped through the floor from one wall to another in a single breath, splitting the concrete inches from Claire's boots. Water welled up through that new wound. Not brown and heavy like floodwater, but clear and oddly luminous, as if it carried daylight from some hidden surface. The room's overhead lights flickered under the surge. In the flicker, the glow from the crack seemed to stand on its own for a moment, bathing their faces from below. Panels shook loose. A section of ceiling near the doorway broke apart, showering fragments and twisted rebar. The foreman staggered back. Vince slipped on the wet concrete and skidded toward the widening gap. He grabbed for the panel housing, fingers clawing at any edge, legs dropping into the churning brightness below. His weight dragged the metal casing, bending it outward, bolts screaming. Adam lunged sideways, one arm still holding the beam that kept him anchored, the other reaching blindly into air that churned with dust and mist. Claire's center of gravity tipped. One of her boots lost purchase as the floor under half her stance fell away. She felt her body slide toward the crack in a series of tiny, unstoppable adjustments, knees buckling, free hands scraping for any grip. Then Adam's fingers locked around her wrist, hard enough to compress skin over bone, not hard enough to bruise in the old, familiar shapes. His grip wrapped her joint completely. He pulled upward with a force that burned into the muscles of his forearm. For an instant, another memory slammed against the moment, a different hand on her arm years ago in a crowded hallway, squeezing too tight as a voice told her she should be grateful anyone wanted her. Her body had recoiled then. This time it pushed toward the grip instead of away. The slab beneath the panel gave way. Vince's grasp vanished into the rush below in a blur of flailing limbs and torn metal. The main section of floor tilted further, threatening to take Claire and Adam with it. Water roared from the crack, pool spray striking her face. The glow from below brightened, filling her peripheral vision. In the shifting light she glimpsed the curve of a woman's profile outlined in the moving water, not a clear face but a repeated pattern, a tilt of head from portrait glass, from ledger margins, from the reflection she occasionally caught between her and the ridge in rental car windows. The sense was not of being dragged under but of an open, weighing surface. Adam braced his back against a support column, tendons in his neck standing out, and tried to haul her across the sliding boundary. His boots scraped against the concrete, searching for friction. Claire's elbow bent. Their joined hands formed a brief, taut bridge between sinking and solid ground. Sirens wailed above, the sound peaking and breaking into a lower note. Her heart slammed once, twice. Her free hand found nothing but wet air as chunks of concrete tore past. She made one more choice in the way she shifted her weight. Rather than curling inward, she twisted her hips and shoulders, using their joined momentum to shove Adam backward toward the stairwell landing. The force rocked him up onto the first step. The jerk tore his grasp from her wrist. Pain shot through the joint as their fingers separated, a bright line that marked the point where contact ended and gravity took over. The last thing she felt was the shock of water catching her, not like a slap but like a cold, firm embrace, folding her in as the slab crashed away. Then light and noise dissolved into pressure and flow. Above ground, the emergency spillway roared to life. Water exploded from culverts along the old river course, a sudden white body throwing itself along the dry channel. Sirens yelped all over town. Volunteer firefighters in reflective jackets went door to door along the low curve of the riverbed, helping residents scramble uphill, kids carried on hips, dogs tugged by collars, favorite shoes abandoned in the mud. Trailers shuddered as the current slapped their stilts. Picnic tables at the county park bobbed once, twice, then tore away. The plant floor drowned in a churning mess of torn conveyors, drifting crates, and twisted rails. Yet the main streets, the school, the hospital on its small rise, and the grid of houses up the slope watched the water pass in a shaking, stunned silence without feeling it at their own knees. In the wake, reporters came with cameras that tried to frame the story in 30-second segments. Engineers gave interviews from the safe distance of other states, using phrases like unprecedented failure modes and complex hydrological feedback. Richard returned in dark sunglasses and a suit that no longer fit as smoothly. At a hotel off the interstate, he sat alone for a minute before a shareholder's call, turning his wallet open on the table. A photo of a much younger Claire, printed on flimsy mall paper from a long-ago email, rested behind the plastic. His thumb worried the edge of that picture until the laminate peeled, then smoothed the corner down again. At the memorial and the high school gym, he stood stiffly when people spoke her name, but at one point his hand clenched a cheap folding chair so hard the metal creaked, and he let it go only when Lily, sitting next to Adam, shifted her shoelaces against the polished floor and drew the room's attention with the small sound. Insurance claims and lawsuits dragged on for months. The gutted skeleton of the plant eventually came down in sections, beams lowered slowly like bones of some extinct thing. What remained in the hollow below was water. Clear. Deep. Unwilling to drain the way planners had expected. Over time, the new lake settled into a round basin edged with rock and scrub. Volunteers organized a trail-building day. Teenagers from the high school carried gravel buckets and joked too loudly to hide nerves about being near the site of so many news stories. Parents planted saplings along the edge. A simple wooden pier jutted out over the surface, anchored by a bench that Adam built in his garage. The grain of the board smoothed under his hands until they felt like something meant to support weight without splintering. The town council named it Monroe Lake after a close vote. The plaque at the trailhead held a brief dedication about courage and community. Most evenings, the lake looked like any other. Wind ruffled its skin, ducks left small V-shaped wakes, and children dared each other to dip toes in the cold. On still nights, though, the surface turned metallic and precise, mirroring the ring of lights installed along the path. In that circle, Adam and Lily's reflections appeared when they walked the loop after dinner, paper cups of diner coffee warming their fingers in cooler seasons, melted ice cream softening in summer. Another slender figure sometimes seemed to stand between them and the water's copy of the world, her head inclined in a posture of listening. When Lily skipped a stone, the ripples bent around that place as if respecting an unseen outline. Life in Redwillow reorganized itself around new contours. The town leaned more into recreation and less into industry, though small workshops and remote workstations sprang up in old storefronts. Adam took fewer distant contracts and more local renovations. One autumn he received an offer from a Seattle firm, good money, steady hours. The printed email lay on his kitchen table for a week, corners curling. On the last evening before the deadline, he folded it once, tucked it in his jacket pocket, and walked with Lily down to the lake instead of answering. They sat on the bench at the pier, shoulders almost touching, and let their feet dangle above the water. The air there held a damp coolness even in October, wrapping skin and breath in a steadier temperature than the rest of town. Lily talked about college brochures and ridiculous dorm rules she had read online, about a mural she wanted to paint on the underpass if the council ever approved it. Her voice jumped and dropped in quick bursts, like stones skipping. Adam listened. Between her sentences he could hear the low, constant sound from deep below the pier, a quieter version of the old pump room hum, now more like music than threat. He ran his fingers along the top rail, the wood worn to a satin sheen by other hands. A faint, answering coolness rose into his skin from the grain, not numb, not shocking, just enough to push his lungs open a fraction wider on the next inhale. Gratitude came then in physical details rather than grand declarations. Lily's laughter when a duck stole a piece of her snack, the way the late sun found copper in her hair, the simple fact that his boots rested on solid boards instead of slick, shifting concrete. Without moving his lips, he formed a wordless thought aimed at the bright, quiet center of the lake. It carried no eloquence, only a steady thank you shaped in muscle and breath. For choosing the line she chose. For the ordinary days that had unspooled since. For the chance to stay. The surface did not ripple in reply. The lights along the path did not flare. Yet for a brief, suspended second, the reflection of the bench showed 3 figures instead of 2 in a clarity that made his throat tighten. Then a breeze ran its fingers across the water and the image broke into soft, ordinary waves. Later that night, back in the garage, he took the folded job offer from his pocket. He smoothed it once on the workbench, then slid it into an old toolbox and shut the lid. His hand lingered on the metal handle, then let go. In the morning he would email a polite refusal and then drive Lily to school along Route 14, past Buck's Diner and the blinking Starbucks sign, past the turnoff to Monroe Lake. Their lives would keep stretching forward in small steps, measured now in their own markers, before the lake, after the first winter, after the night he chose to stay. Behind them, the water held the fading light a little longer than the sky. Its surface glowed with the last thin gold of day, reluctant to give it up. In that delayed release lay something that felt like a promise, that when earth and water in choices collided, the story did not end at the break. It continued in the quiet acts of people who still came to the shore, who still touched the rail, who still let their hearts open half a beat wider at the thought of the woman who had once turned a valve and stepped into the unknown so that their ordinary, complicated lives could unfold on steadier ground.